Welcome to the Coleman Insights Ask Me Anything webinar. My name is Kimberly Bryant, and I am the Director of Client Services here at Coleman Insights. And here with me today are consultants Jay Nachlis and Meghan Campbell. Thank you so much again for joining us. This is our Ask Me Anything webinar series where we will be answering your questions related to research, branding, and marketing strategy in audio entertainment. On today's AMA episode, we will be covering podcasting. Now, we did receive a number of questions from your registration forms that we will be answering today. However, please feel free to use the chat feature on here and ask additional questions that you may have while we're talking. And if we have time, we will try and address those towards the end. So we're going to jump right on in. Our first question is from Savannah. Jay, can you tell us what trends are you seeing in podcasting right now?
Well, the beginning and ending of that question is YouTube. That is something that you're not only seeing get mentioned and talked about a lot in podcasting, but YouTube is important in research that you're seeing in the industry. Podcast consumption, podcast discovery. YouTube is coming up as an important platform, sometimes a leading platform. And, in some ways, this probably sounds a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because podcasting is an audio medium, but YouTube's impact and influence on the medium is really important because as much as sometimes people in the podcast industry get caught up in, well, if it's on YouTube, it's not a podcast, consumers really don't see it that way. They don't think that way. So if I listen to like The Daily, whether I'm listening to it on Spotify or on YouTube, doesn't really matter. It's still a podcast, and that's just how they're consuming it. And also remember that consumers use YouTube in a couple different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're actively watching the video content that you're putting out there. There's a pretty hefty percentage of people that minimize YouTube on their device and they're listening. And it's also important to remember that YouTube is not relegated to younger demos. This is a real cross demo platform to reach people. So YouTube and podcasting is clunky, like for real. It's not the greatest. It's not the greatest website for podcast consumption, but they recognize that and they're working on it. There are new tools out there for creators. Their plan is to move podcasts or feature podcasts on YouTube Music, where they can have RSS feeds. It can look all pretty with the show notes and the thumbnails and everything else. But there's challenges there, right? Because YouTube has over 2 billion users and YouTube Music has about 100 million. Plus, you're going to try this whole new brand of getting people to use podcasts. So we'll see if that works. But the end of all of that is to say, if anything, you have to have a YouTube strategy if you're a podcaster. It could be repurposing the content that you're putting out on the audio platforms. It could be a podcast trailer. It could be snackable content of highlights to bring you to the other platforms. But regardless, there has to be a strategy because YouTube is just a huge player in the podcasting space.
Yeah, definitely. I'm seeing that as well, just on a personal front.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question is from Danielle. Meghan, how do you make a guest whom you did not select, chosen by management, sound interesting when in all actuality they are not engaging or interesting enough to be on your show?
Wow. What a great question. Thank you, Danielle. I'm sure Danielle is not the only person on this call that's been faced with a similar situation. And I am not an expert in making an uninteresting guest interesting, but so my approach would be just make sure you don't find yourself in that situation in the first place. And that can really only be achieved when everyone working on the podcast, contributing to the podcast, making decisions about the podcast are all on the same page. And that's true whether your podcast is an extension of a radio station or show or one that's completely independent of radio. So how do you get there? I'd suggest that you get everyone involved, from management to talent to contributors, into one room. an actual room or a virtual one like this one, and lay out your strategy for your podcast. Identify and script out the purpose and the plot of your podcast. What are the roles of each of the hosts if there are more than one? What messages do you want your audience to take away from the podcast? So what is your podcast promising to the audience day in and day out? And so what kind of guests meet that promise and purpose, and what topics and content? So once you have all that laid out, make sure you have buy-in from the whole team. This way, everyone will examine potential comment or content and guests through the same lens or filter. And hopefully that leads to fewer off-brand suggestions from management. And if not, at least it makes it easier for you to challenge those suggestions. You can say clearly, this doesn't fit our strategy that we all agreed on in our meeting. This content, this guest, it's just not lining up with our mission.
Yeah, great advice for sure. All right, Jay, I have a question for you from Mike McVeigh. What's the most important thing for a podcast to present in its first 5 minutes?
Good question, Mike McVeigh. I like that. Can I first answer by saying what you shouldn't do within the first 5 minutes of a podcast? Commercials. Honestly, like that drives me crazy. If I'm listening to a podcast and it starts with a pre-roll and it goes right into commercials, I think that's a problem. I mean, a lot of this is it's the same thing that you would say to somebody in radio or any form of entertainment, right? Which is engage them right off the bat. I think the first thing to remember or keep in mind strategically from a mindset standpoint is when you're starting any episode of a podcast, consider that somebody's listening to it for the first time. So in the first minute, we're talking about what is the show, what's the elevator pitch, who are the hosts and why should I care, and what's coming up in that episode. Like that's the first minute. And then I would go into the meatiest, best, juiciest first part of the podcast segment. And then you can go into commercials, right? Years ago, our friend Steve Reynolds, talent coach, told me this story about Wheel of Fortune. And he said, it reminded me that years ago, Wheel of Fortune used to interview the contestants in the beginning of the show before they got to the game. And they realized that, well, people want to get right into the game. That's why they're there, is to play the game. So, you watch Wheel now and it goes immediately into the puzzle. And then after you get some, you're in it, then, of course, you can get introduced to the contestants. It's the same thing with Jeopardy, and everyone's kind of taking that template now. But it's also the same thing for podcasts. Tell them why you're there, get them interested and hooked, and then you can play a commercial.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Meghan, we're going to bring it back to you. I have a question from Angela. Morning show best practices. Are uploads of the whole show the way to go? Or should they create an after show podcast? Good question.
That is a great question. And first of all, just kudos to you for having a digital strategy in mind for a morning show. I think that's a great first step. Digital strategies can be limited based on resources. So it may be that you don't have the time, energy, money to create anything else. So your only options are uploading a whole show or snackable segments of the show that are the best of. And that can be a strategy, at least a starting point. But if you do have the bandwidth to create something more, then by all means do so. I know that the KVJ show on WRMF in West Palm Beach does an 18 plus podcast every day. It's done very, very well. It's on brand, but the content is edgier than what they can do on air. So what they've done is created an opportunity to grow an audience above and beyond what they already have on FM radio. So if you're going to do something like this, you just need to make sure that what you create is an extension of your brand. It should still sound very much like the content and shows you have on the air, but you will have a little bit more leeway to give the audience more. So think about it. Completely different topics are now available that wouldn't be on air. So you have a lot to give at that point, a lot of growth potential there. So once you have it on air, look for ways to drive people to the radio from the podcast and vice versa, which the two together, you can work to strengthen your listening base and therefore your brand.
Yeah, great advice. All right. Jay, I have a question here. What do you make of the recent negative headlines surrounding podcasting?
The demise of podcasting is greatly exaggerated. Yeah, there have been some of those headlines. It's, some of that honestly is artificial. And that's because of the pandemic, right? Everyone knows that podcasting was impacted by the pandemic, actually in some ways, a very beneficial way. Audience behavior went up. The amount of people doing podcasting went up because everyone, the mostly people listen to podcasts at home, and people were home, so they're consuming podcasts, right? And so when things went wild, you also saw networks and platforms like Spotify. It was like the Wild West out there. You get a podcast and you get a podcast, and there's crazy money being spent. And so, in some respects, what we're seeing is kind of a retracting to normalcy. And so, you see the headlines and it's all negative, negative, negative. And it's like, okay, calm down. It's not as negative as you think. That's number one. Now, number two is as the medium is maturing a little bit, we are seeing that from an advertising standpoint, there are some issues that the industry has to address. And that is, although there are some things from an analytics standpoint about podcasting that are really good, you can very easily on hosting platforms find out what your downloads are, where people are listening from, what their demographics are. All that kind of stuff is valuable. But at the same time, there's not the kind of synchronicity that you'd like to see between all of the different platforms, between Apple and Spotify and all the other hosts. And that makes it difficult from an advertising agency if you're buying on a larger level. It's one thing if I've got a health and wellness podcast and I want to go sell it to Athletic Greens and they believe in what I do and it's a great match for the target. But if you're buying on a much larger level, then it's the same thing is why you have to trust to a certain level. You have to trust Nielsen on the radio side or Eastland. And so on the podcasting side, it's just something that they really have to work on to make sure that there's a consistency in the measurement going forward, which is really going to be beneficial to podcasting as a whole.
Definitely. Well, Meghan, I have one quick last question for you. What kind of podcast research do you recommend?
Well, it probably depends on what your biggest questions are, but thankfully there is data out there. Jay just explained how it's not perfect, but most podcasts can benefit from some at least top line information on downloads, listening, and know where their demographic strength is and how people are accessing their podcast. But there's other things you can do. So there's options like content testing. We have a media EKG product that we have that allows second by second analysis of your content. So you could explore that if you want to actually find out what types of content is really appealing to your audience. If there's anything that you do that, causes tune out or causes them to turn away. There's also qualitative research as an option. If you want to really dig into the whys of behavior and really find out not just what demographics you appeal to, but why you appeal to some and not another, why people are coming to your podcast versus others, or why they leave it. There's a lot of options out there. So I just would say partner with a research company that you trust that can help guide you in the right direction to get your answers that you're looking for.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. That is all the time we have today. Thank you, Jay and Meghan. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions for today's episode. Got a lot of great information. If you asked a question that we didn't get a chance to address, or if you even have follow-up questions, please feel free to contact Jay or Meghan directly. If you check out the chat feature, you can see both of their email addresses in there. You can also find them, I believe, on our website, but it's Nachlis at ColemanInsights.com and Meghan Campbell at ColemanInsights.com. Keep an eye on our website and social media for information on our next episode. And if you aren't already, make sure to subscribe for our Tuesdays with Coleman blog on our website. But until then, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.